What if we can positively impact society by reshaping the mindsets of young men? And while we're at it, let me ask you, what does it mean to be a man? My name is Dennis Meralda, a father, a teacher, a coach, a mentor, and a principal with over 2 decades of experience shaping the minds and characters of young men across the United States. If these questions resonate, if you're a young man looking to improve your life or a parent looking for tools to help your son become the best version of himself, the Building Men podcast was created for you. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Building Men podcast. For those of you who have listened before and to the new audience, welcome. My name is Dennis Meralda. I am your host. As always, I'm joined today by George. He runs the Instagram page, The Tin Men, something I am totally fascinated with recently. And the handle or the tag for The Tin Men is widening perspectives around men, uncomfortable conversations, and ugly truths, unpopular other half of gender equality and men's mental health. So reading that, hearing that, following along with his page, I have been fascinated with what he's doing. George, welcome to the podcast, brother.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
You got it, dude. So first of all, I'm looking for your last name. I couldn't find it. It's just George, which I think it's cool because like you think about the people that go by one name. It's like Prince, Cher, Madonna, Bono, like Sting. I just like the simplicity of George.
Yeah,
right?
Well, I mean, that's a lovely way of putting it, but the reason is lots more, well, quite sad actually. I don't want to give people my full name because I just think some of the things I talk about would invite people to basically ruin my life in ways that I wouldn't appreciate. So I try to remain, but my name actually is George. I won't give you my full name because just for my privacy. And I also, in a separate vein, I don't want my account to be about me. You won't really find many photos of me on my own page. Like I know the typical thing of an influencer is you have like a bit of text post and the next post be a photo of you and then more text and then a photo of you. And then you're just seeing photos of people like their faces. And like, I find it quite narcissistic and I kind of hate it. So I try not to have any photos of me. I try not to tell anyone my full name. Obviously you need to have my name a little bit so we can have conversations, but it isn't about me. And secondly, more importantly, it is a matter of sort of personal safety, if I'm honest.
Right.
So yeah, but I like your analogy to Prince.
Oh yeah, and it's just George. Like you are just out there as George, the
George,
one name thing, the George.
Yeah.
So I'm talking to the George tonight. It's quite an honor.
Well, thank you. No one knew my name at all for a few years, and it was only when I got to about 20,000 followers that I was just like, hi. Because I do, and in fact, it was interesting because people were like, "Oh, should you or should you not? Should you have your face? Should you blur it out?" And I refused to blur out my face because then it looks like I have something to hide. It looks like I am guilty. Look, I look like a literal criminal if I did the whole pixel facing. Right. So I'm not ashamed of what I do. I'm not really afraid, but it would be silly of me to give you my full name and like my address and my national insurance number and stuff like that. So.
Do you get recognized right now if you're walking around? Do you get people that are like, "Oh, I know you from your Instagram handle"?
Only once recently, okay. And I was buying a coffee from someone, and he was just like, the barista was like, "Hey, I don't think I recognize your face. Is it from TV?" I was like, "This face, TV? I don't think so, mate." And then I was like, rushed off.
Ran out of there.
I was like, "See you later." And I don't like it. No, I don't like I wouldn't hate to be recognized. I mean, obviously, it'd be nice for someone to say thank you, but.
Well, I'll say thank you, George. Thank you. I like looking at your face right now, and thank you. Where did the Tin Men come from? Where does that idea come from?
Well, originally, same as not wanting to have my name, like it was a pseudonym. But the actual creative origin of the Tin Men as a concept was in reference to the Wizard of Oz, the character, the Tin Man, and he joins Dorothy on her journey to Emerald City. And basically, the Tin Man is looking for his heart. So there's the Scarecrow, there's the Lion, there's Dorothy, and the Tin Man. The Tin Man's looking for his heart. That's his whole narrative. And at the end, and it's a spoiler, it turns out he already had a heart the whole time. And I'm like, what a beautiful like metaphor for how I see men. Like we're constantly called, all these different things under the sun, and told that we're sort of inhuman, stone men. And I feel like if men give themselves a little bit of credit and look inside, you'll see that we do have a heart and we're not made of stone. So I'm not the Tin Man. The Tin Men are all men, in my opinion. Yeah, so that's where it came from.
I love that. And the other thing is, when I think about Wizard of Oz too, with all the different characters that come,
Mm.
that Dorothy comes across, the Scarecrow, like even like how are men using their brains? How are
Yeah,
like the whole courage thing
yeah,
as well? Like,
yeah.
what does it actually look like? I talk so much about the courage of being vulnerable because it takes a lot of
Mm.
courage to be vulnerable. Like the cowardly lion, like the whole time he
Mm.
really did have that inside of me, just
Mm.
wasn't sure quite how to access it. So George, I'm going to throw a couple stats out to you. Because one of the things that you talk about in your page, if you're not following the 10 men, go and follow it right now, because it's looking at things from a little bit of a different perspective. And I'll
Mm.
start with saying, and I think you'll appreciate this as well. I remember growing up in the 1980s in school, and I wound up becoming an educator, a school principal, and boys were really struggling, or girls were struggling when compared to boys in science and in math.
Mm.
Right? They were just
Mm.
like they're getting worse grades. They weren't, accessing careers in those fields. And so we looked at that issue and we said, girls are struggling when compared to boys. What's wrong with our schools?
Mm.
And it's
Yeah.
swung so far in the other direction. Now boys are struggling in every single area in schools when compared to girls, except for like a hands-on tactile shop type class or
Mm.
physical education. So girls are outperforming boys by far in schools. And we're looking
Mm.
at the situation, we're saying, what's wrong with the boys?
Absolutely.
And like when I hear that, it enrages me because we're doing a poor job. What are some things that you have heard and seen as far as like the disparity that we're seeing between boys and girls and their success that you feel like would be really important for people to know about?
Well, I mean, I'll start by saying it's not just in school where we see that phenomenon of basically blaming boys and men for their own sort of shortcomings. Like, obviously, one thing I talk about is like men who die early, and people are like, well, they should go to the doctor, or male depression, male loneliness, a big one. Well, men should talk more, or like, God help you if you ever talk about a man who's being assaulted on the street, or who's doing it. And it's like, oh, like it's just we seem to be obsessed with throwing blame at the feet of men and boys. Worst of all for boys, because we're actually talking about children. And you are right. It's that, in the early 1970s and before, young women and girls were behind in school. They were underrepresented. And in the 50 years since then, we've had a huge plethora of legal changes for the good of women, which I support. But now it's actually flipped completely, and more so to the point where boys and men are now further behind than women and girls were 50 years ago. So the problem is inverted. But the way in which it's is different is that no one seems to want to make any of the changes to help boys and men out. If in fact we're just going to, it seems like we're just keep going. We're going to keep going with all the same sort of ideas.
To learn more about our programs, including one-on-one mentorship coaching, the foundation, our Building Men online group community for young men, or to bring a Building Men experience to your school, check out our website, buildingmen.io, or click the links in the bio. Now, back to the show.
I mean, people always ask me why are boys behind in school? And I mean, I actually don't know. I mean, that's the real honest answer. We don't know because no one wants to find out. We have like in America, for example, we have like the National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education, which is all about getting women and girls into different areas of education, which is quite rightly to do. But no such organization exists for boys and men in education. And then, as you said, like soon about 40% of graduates of college in America will be boys. So we get to a point where even after that, 2 to 1, 2 women for every 1 male. And in my country, it's soon the gap between boys and girls in school is going to be bigger than the gap between rich and poor. So it is alarming. And just to quote one of the greatest authorities on higher education attainment in the UK, perhaps the world, Mary Kernick Cook, who was the boss of UCAS, she's saying that it's even more alarming because the gap between rich and poor, north and south, different areas of the country, we may not like those gaps, but we understand why they happen. We know why rich kids do better than poor kids, but no one really knows why boys are doing better than girls. We have ideas, but we don't know for sure because no one is actually really cares enough to find out. It's a very, some reason, unpopular topic to talk about. But I mean, theoretically, it could be, we talk about not enough male teachers in school. There's arguments that because there's like 4 in 5 teachers are women, they grade girls higher for the same work. That's been shown, a systemic bias against boys. So a systemic bias against boys. People don't like the idea of systemic bias against men and boys at all, but it's pretty clear. So we have that. We have more likely to problematize boys' behavior, so marked lower for the same work, punished more harshly for the same behavior. We have this argument that as we move towards more sitting, more reading, more quiet time, that is less appropriate for boys. It's by no means excellent for girls, but it's worse for boys. Boys like kinespatial learning, it's like more physical activities. They like getting up and about, need bigger classrooms, more time in like recess. There's arguments quite controversial. These come from people like Richard Reeves that boys should be starting school a year after girls because they have a delayed mental development. I mean, there's loads. There's so many. But as we've moved away from vocational learning, the gap has only gotten bigger. As we've moved away from sort of coursework, the gap's gotten bigger. And now we're moving more towards exams. It's just worse and worse and worse. So there's some ideas. I'm sure there's more I'll come up with, but the ultimate answer is I don't know. We don't know. And the better question is, why don't we know?
Right.
And why is no one asking the question?
Agreed. And not only the kinesthetic learning, the more movement, boys are told at a very young age. I mean, schools in general are, it's creating the factory worker, the subservient. Boys are told, walk in a straight line, close your mouth, sit down, shut up. Only speak when you're spoken to. Like if you're and it's like the reticular activating system, what you look for, you will see. If you see boys as active, you will they're more likely to get in trouble than girls. The stats are really overwhelming. The number of percentage of boys versus girls classified into special services, 66% of classified students are boys. 70% of students that are arrested before the age of 18 are boys. 70% of students that are suspended from school are boys. You mentioned already the statistics with college bound students. It's trending towards 2-1. And then one of the most interesting things is the kids that are placed in juvenile facilities that are said that they were not able to be educated in a public setting. 95% of kids in a juvenile facility are boys. And so what we're doing is we're saying the problem is with the boys. No, like you're saying, the problem is with us. Like, what can we do differently? And George, you talk about 41% of boys aged 12 to 16 are taught that the young men are currently a problem in society. Like they're being told that, and boys are like, they have to apologize that they were born with a penis. It's like, I am so sorry right now that I was born.
And quite literally. Now there's a famous story in Australia where the boys in the school in like a class assembly all had to stand up and apologize to the girls, and they were like, I don't know, 10, 8. I think one of them was 8, 9, 10. And I'm like, what are they apologizing for? And like, what are you talking? Like, they're just innately bad, and it is horrifying. Like in Australia, again, there's a new program getting rolled out where boys as young as 5 are going to be taught about toxic masculinity, and it's outrageous. It's disgraceful. And we talk a lot about people like Andrew Tate and his merry band of misogynists, who I despise, and I'm happy to call out, and how we talk about how they are indoctrinating boys, and they are, but no one seems to talk about how other groups, other equally nefarious groups, in my opinion, are also indoctrinating boys, and they're going into school and they are giving these obscene workshops. And not only are they painting boys as predators or rapists in waiting, but they're not supporting boys either. They're not supporting boys who are vulnerable to, bullying or sexual abuse or violence. And it is one of the things I think we'll look back at 5 or 10 years from now with absolute shame, because we have failed boys, and their failure is not really their failure. It's our failure as a society. But sorry, I interrupted you. Go on.
No, I agree with you. I'm glad you said that. Well, I'll pivot slightly and talk about that term, toxic masculinity. It's something that you hear all the time. And it's interesting. I have a son who's 18 years old. I have a daughter who's 16, a daughter who's 13. And my 16-year-old daughter is much like, she is so much of an academic. I've never seen her without a book in her hand. And she just did like an essay, a research topic around comparing a couple famous works of literature, but talking about it from the perspective of the men in the book. And so she brought up the term, and she said she doesn't believe that toxic masculinity exists. So she was basically coming from it from a different perspective, saying like, what if it's society that's telling the boys that this is a thing? And what if we reframe that and say there are toxic male ideologies, like there are those type of things, but what if we don't say that anymore? So this is a female that's saying this in school, and she got ripped apart by coming to it from this perspective.
Yeah, I get loads of people messaging me like that, and good for them to show independent thought and courage to say that sort of thing, and fully support that. I get loads of people messaging me about saying, I used some of your citations or your work or your words to challenge my sociology or psychology professor, even like right up to higher education, or right down to like primary school. Like young boys and girls are challenging these ideas, and it is almost always ending in them being castigated or failed. And I'm like, God damn, like I failed school because I was a bit of a contrarian and I challenged teachers and they didn't like it. And I was sort of routinely told that I was stupid or failure. And at the amount of times I got sat down at the end of my bed by both my parents, being like, you're not a bad boy, you're not a stupid boy, you're a smart lad, but you just got to try harder. I had that every single year when I had my grades, like fail, fail, fail. And at no point did my parents question maybe the school is what's failing me. And I know I'm not stupid, but I was taught I was stupid. And it took me a long time to realize that I was not the problem. The problem was the educational system, in my opinion.
And so when kids are hearing that, like you're saying, kids are exposed to the 27% of kids hear the term toxic male or toxic masculinity in that middle school age range. What are you saying to those kids that are hearing that? Like, what if they're coming to you and they're saying, George, like, what is this a real thing? What does this mean? How should I think about this?
I would say boys are just as easily influenced by toxic attitudes as girls. Like the interesting thing about toxic masculinity, and the reason why I don't like that term, is that it puts the problem inside of men and boys' heads as if they are the ones that are toxic, and all their problems can somehow be solved by a simple change of toxic mindset, where a much better rewording would be like talking about toxic attitudes toward masculinity. That's the real problem, because the problem is not in my brain. The problem is out there, and the toxic attitudes that men and boys are exposed to and then can be sort of internalized. It's interesting, like we talk about, if I were to put down a Barbie, that original Barbie, not this crazy woke Barbie, original Barbie, like the blonde, the blonde blue head Barbie, the archetype of misogyny in many ways. She's got to be quiet, she's beautiful, she has to be her perfect skin, that tall, leggy blonde, subservient to Ken. That is misogyny. And for her to have those beliefs is internalized misogyny. But Ken, who is, muscular and tall and brave and heroic, we call him toxic. We don't say that's internalized toxic masculinity or internalized misandry. We say he's the toxic one. And unlike Barbie, who's just a recipient of toxic attitudes towards women, we blame Ken as the instigator of his own toxicity, whereas in fact he is just like Barbie. He is a victim of toxic attitudes towards masculinity, and we are all perpetuating them, including women, including dads, including mums, including boys, including men. And it is a societal problem. What is influencing men and boys? Like everything from the news, the media, like social media advocates, politics. We are all failing boys and men, and yet we only ever blame men and boys through these obscene, hateful neologisms. That just yet again another thing for us to be embarrassed by in 10 years' time. I'm embarrassed by it because I used to totally buy into that ideology myself, and I'm looking back at it like this. And I'm sure the people that are using it now, they'll be looking back at it right now with a similar, I hope they are looking back at it with shame. But I would say to the boys, you are not toxic, you are not broken, you're not defective. You are boys, and there's nothing wrong with being a boy. There's nothing wrong with being a man. There's nothing wrong with masculinity. You're not a defective girl. You're not a defective boy. Not a defective woman. You are who you are, and there's no shame in being a boy or a man, or being a masculine boy or man.
I'll call people to take a look at the post that you did on September 4th. It's called The Great Shame. And It was really interesting to me. One, I loved it because you basically pulled me back into growing up. Like, I was the kid that had the mullet. I was the kid that had, like, I shaved like a lightning bolt into the side of my head. And I look back and I'm like, oh, wow, I can't believe that I did this. I wore these pants. I cuffed my jeans in a certain way. But I look back with this like disgust, like, oh, I can't believe I did this. What you're saying in the post basically is like, will we look back and in our heads, like, think about, can I go back and think, I can't believe I went along with these things that were going on, and why couldn't I see that? So talk to us a little bit about what you meant by that great shame.
Well, I'm the perfect person to talk about it because my hair is absurd. But there is only so much I can do about this. It's called a double crown, and basically means my hair is fucked for life. But what I'm saying in that post is that it was much worse than this, much worse. And I look back at photos of not only my hair, but the things I wore with just so much embarrassment. Like I used to wear head to toe velour tracksuit. And it was horrific. Like I used to wear these massive basketball shoes that were like probably three sizes too big, that were bright red, like a silky tracksuit and horrible hair. And at the time, I was utterly convinced that was cool. I looked great. That was the right decision to make. But it was through time and hindsight that I can look back and be like, I can't believe I did that. And the post you're talking about is basically repositioning that same phenomenon, but within a political space where are we going to look back at what we did, especially to boys and also to men? Or are we going to look back at these days with the same sense of shame that I felt, but for my hair? Like the interesting thing is that we have already been through this process and we haven't learned from it. Where in the same way that we pathologize male distress as toxic masculinity, 100 years ago, we pathologized women's distress and we called it female hysteria. So we'd have a woman who was distressed about something and we made her the problem. We were, oh, she's just suffering of female hysteria. And we subjected her to the same bogus ideologies and these crazy corrective treatments. And now we're just doing the same to men and boys. We're not listening to what's distressing them. We're saying you're the problem and you have to fix it through these obscene mindset changes that no one really quite understands. But we haven't learned from it.
As you're telling that story, I picture there was a song "Pretty Fly for a White Guy," and that's the picture of you with the velour, with the sneakers honestly, and everything too. 100%.
I wanted to put a photo of me in that post, but even it was just too embarrassing. It was honestly, and I'm sure in another 10 years I'll look back at maybe even this podcast and be like, what? But I mean, I'm quite modest now. I dress now. I can't possibly be wrong.
Yeah, it's very conservative what you're doing right now. So now I'd love to know if I was going to say what's taught, what's the philosophy, what are the pillars if there's going to be the Tin Men School. So what should boys be learning? Like what are we doing there? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like?
I mean, I don't have children, so it's difficult to say so, but I would just encourage a boy like anyone else just to be whoever they want to be. Like they can wear whatever they want, they can do whatever they like, they can dress or say or act in whatever way they choose to, and whether that's more typically feminine or typically masculine is totally their choice. And either should be equally lifted up. I wouldn't even want to answer that question because I'd want the hypothetical boy, to answer that for himself and for me to be a facilitator of that thing, whatever that is. And of all the talk I see politically of autonomy, especially within women, we talk a lot about women's autonomy, but often I find it's, for a lot of people, it's only autonomy to do the things that we want them to do, the things that are most politically convenient. Like there is so little autonomy given to women who choose to be a stay-at-home mum. Like people seem to hate that, and well, that's just autonomy too. But I would say go outside, take some calculated risks. Go outside, go into a field, climb a tree, fall out of it. Just don't, hurt yourself too bad. One of the things I've learned recently is like there is very, I'm aware a lot of, kids and their parents are watching this. So I don't want to burst the bubble, but I've recently learned that homework has very little impact on the child's success or intelligence later in life, and really that time should be spent outside playing with other children and parents, and like making mistakes and not being coddled, being exposed to what's called real life, and not sat there doing yet more work, which will just stamp out the magic of education. And I would say childhood is best spent being a child. And I grew up in the countryside, and I spent all day in the fields, in the forests, within wildlife. I would come back just covered in mud and grass stains and maybe cuts and bruises. And that was my education. And I found that at least as formative as my formal education, perhaps even more so. And I mean, a lot of that comes from fathers. A lot of the physical rough and tumble, roughhousing play comes from dads. And that is really, really important for boys because it teaches a lot about consent and different types of touch. Because a lot of time boys grow up and they learn that the only two types of touch are like sexual or like violence. Well, obviously, that is just two of many. And roughhousing teaches boys a lot about physical touch and limits and consent and communication. I can't wait to have a child because it's going to be like roughhousing a lot, but obviously not too much. And I would take them out and I would try and help them find who they are and lift that person up and expose them to as many different things as possible. And only one of those would be homework. So that's what I would do. But I mean,
Yeah.
easy for me to say that as I don't have a child. I don't quite understand how difficult it is. But that's the best I got for you.
And I agree on the homework 100%. And as a principal, I would discourage teachers from giving homework. And if you did, it had to be something that would enhance whatever you were doing the next day. Like they would come in with a little bit more. But more than anything, like encourage the movement, encourage them to explore, encourage them to figure out their own voice, and then to be curious. And if that curiosity led them to reading and researching something else, that's wonderful. But if all it did was made them want to go outside more, that's great as well. Kids need to get outside. They need to move. They need to play. They need to explore. So you mentioned, George, while you don't have children of your own, like a lot of the things that you've done is talked about like the role that a father and a mother do play. And like what they're getting or what children are getting from the masculine and from the feminine. And I've found that very interesting as well, especially for boys that are being raised in a family where there's not a strong father figure. And some of the stats that I've seen, and this is coming from in my region, the United States, 1 in 3 young men have no positive male role model in their life. And boys that grow up without a positive male role model before the age of 18, they're 2 times more likely to commit a violent crime, and they're 4 times more likely to live in poverty than boys who have a positive male role model. So it speaks to the importance of it as well. And one last thing, and I'd love to get your reaction on this as well. The average school age boy, so we're talking middle school, high school age boy, spends on average of 30 minutes per week in a one-on-one conversation with a positive adult male role model. Could be a father, a teacher, a coach. 30 minutes a week on average. That same boy on average spends 44 hours per week in front of a screen, video games, social media, and or television. So 90 times more on average being influenced by a screen of some sort rather than a conversation with an adult male role model. So first, what is your reaction to hearing those stats? And would you find that fairly consistent in the UK as well?
I just want to, as like a reaction I continually have, there needs to be a new word invented for it, but it's like the combination of being like really deeply saddened, but simultaneously unsurprised. Like that is a horrific statistic to hear, but also totally unsurprising. And I would love to know what that research paper is, because that's something I would love to post about. But I'd say boys are deprived of role models in 3 different ways. Firstly, through the lack of father figures. And it's like 1 in 4 boys in America grow up without any father figure at all at home. And then 80% of those boys have no male teacher at school. So that's the second part. So 80% of teachers are women. And then obviously in the media, just turn on the TV and see what sort of role models we're giving to boys, especially as fathers. Like fathers are routinely and almost universally portrayed as just oafish babysitters, incompetent clowns, just like awful, poor, like it got so bad in the UK that the Advertising Standards Authority had to step in and say no more clownish dads in TV. And they started banning adverts because they were just completely peddling out this trope, this inaccurate trope of incompetent dads. There's this advert that got banned that it was like a man trying to hold his baby at a sushi restaurant, and he puts his baby down and he puts it onto the conveyor belt. Oh, what an idiot. And the baby gets taken away. And it got banned. And I'm like, fine, good. I'm not pro censorship. When it gets to a point where the only dad you see on TV is a clown, second-class parent, a babysitter, it's not good enough. And the damage is so huge, especially when it's compounded by the fatherlessness and the lack of male teachers. And then obviously you have like Homer Simpson or Peter Griffin or Hal, like just literally just look at a TV program, especially for children, and just honestly look at the dearth of positive male role models and see how incompetent they all are. All of them are. And then obviously opposite these clownish fathers, you normally have an overworked mother, which is often not a particularly helpful stereotype either. And I also want to say, I don't want to sanitize TV. I don't want to be like, oh, let's just have these really boring one-dimensional characters. Because I do like Homer Simpson. And he is a good role model in some ways, but it's just too much. It is way too much. And like a lot of dads, I'm sure, listening to this might go to the playground of their child, and they know full well the looks they get, a lot of them from women, as if they're some sort of paedophile for standing. I get loads of men messaging me saying that, oh, I took my son or daughter especially daughter, a man takes his daughter to the playground on his own, and he's just sat there being a good dad, as we asked him to be, and then someone will come up to him and like confront him like he's a like a paedophile in a playground, and it is horrific. I read a story recently about a man who got pepper sprayed by a woman for taking a photo of his own child. Like, it's hilarious, but it's horrific at the same time. And like, that is not a problem men can solve. That is a problem society has to take accountability for and stop doing, and start to treat fathers as equally competent parents to mothers and allow them to actually step into that role. There's no good like saying men need to do more if we're going to continually treat them as just inept father figures. And then obviously, I guess you have to look into the actual more literal disadvantages that fathers face, so legal ones. So how fathers legally don't have equal rights to their own parents, and fathers legally don't have equal parental leave to mothers. Like in the UK, my sister had children recently, and she was entitled to about a year's worth of paid parental leave as a mother. And her husband, who is a wonderful man, he got 2 weeks. So I don't understand how a father in 2 weeks can form these bonds with their child when a mother has 52 weeks. And women pay the price for that too, because they can't go back to work. They get paid less. They miss out on promotions as a consequence, and that's where the pay gap comes from. So it's not the pay gap is not a gap between women and men. The gap is between mothers and fathers, because fathers go back to work, mothers don't, and if they do, it's part time, and they get paid less. So not only are fathers paying the price of the lack of parental leave, but mothers pay it indirectly, and it doesn't help anyone. So you got poor role models in media, few role models at home for fatherhood, no real male teachers at school. TV is turned on, and you get these oafish clowns that help no one. And then you just got the political lack of literal rights for men, like literal rights that men don't have. And no one will ever say that. Like, that is a controversial thing to say, but it is absolutely true. Fathers don't have equal rights, and they should. Like, you can't, like, ultimately the other half of responsibility are rights, and you cannot ask someone to give equal responsibility if you're not willing to give them equal rights. And fathers deserve both. They should be equally responsible, but they deserve equal rights, and they're not getting them. So that's what I'll say.
And I agree with everything you just said there. And the interesting thing is, if I go into a school and I'm promoting what I'm doing with building men, what I hear first and foremost is, well, what about the girls? What are you going to do with the girls? What about the transgender population? What about LGBTQ? Like, what about all? And absolutely, they do need a space to speak, but so do the boys. And I shouldn't have to apologize for wanting to help young men really understand what it means to be a man in the world today. And here's the other thing. One thing that you talk about, George, is the whole idea of domestic violence and abuse. And while the stats are something along the lines of 1 in 5, 1 in 4 men is the victim of domestic abuse in some capacity, how many men are not reporting? What is the numbers that we're not hearing? Because for a man to go and say, I just got attacked or beat, right? Like, what is the underreported value there as well? So talk to us a little bit about like what your research has shown in that realm, and like men being the victim of abusive situation.
I mean, by its very nature, we don't know what men aren't telling us. So it's very difficult to answer your question. But what I do know in the UK, interesting study by the Mankind Initiative, who are excellent, they found that about men who are being abused are about 2.5 times less likely to tell the police. And often because our data, our domestic violence data in the UK especially, is based on police reports. Those men who are being abused not only are they not being helped by the police, but they're not being captured in governmental data. So they're just completely invisible. The numbers I know, like when you actually survey men and women, rather than using police reports, it's 50-50, more or less. Women are more likely to be severely hurt, but only because men have larger physical advantages than women. But in terms of actual instances of physical domestic violence between partners, it's 50-50. And there was just simply no more argument against that. The amount of research that provides that substantiates that claim, we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers, surveys and studies done by the greatest domestic violence researchers that have ever lived, and millions and millions of sample size, like huge sample. It's not even arguable anymore. And yet people will probably be turning off this podcast right now because they don't like what I say. But I will say it again, domestic violence is not a gendered issue, and men and women are equally violent in relationships, although women are more likely to be severely hurt. But even that's not by a huge amount. The difference is how we capture the data and what we consider abuse. So in the UK, it's about 1 in 3 victims is a man. But again, that's because we ask police. In Canada, it's 1 in 3 as well, because that Statistics Canada also uses police reports. But in America, it's 50-50, because in America, it's the CDC doing the studies, and they do what's called the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey, where they call people up. They call people up and ask them. So men can't really avoid it as easily. The only difference is, although it's 50-50, the only difference is that we don't help men. We don't help men at all. We only ever see them as perpetrators of violence and never as victims. It's gotten so bad in the UK where, in terms of sexual violence, a man cannot be raped by a woman by law. So in the UK, rape is a gendered phenomenon, and women cannot perpetuate it at all, not to men or anyone else. So lesbian women, too bad, you're not covered. And it is outrageous. So that's the same in domestic violence. The gendered models of domestic violence, such as the Duluth model, paint, and I mean quite literally, paint all abusers as men and all victims as women. And the Duluth model is now the most influential model of abuse, and it has been exported across the world. And it is a feminist framework, I'm afraid to say. And it has erased millions of abused men and boys. And that is the worst hairstyle, velour, tracksuit combo you could possibly imagine. Right. And that is so far beyond shame. That is a disgrace. And people that are still propping up that model, that antiquated model, that is like 20 or 30 years old, whose own founder, Ellen Pence, said it does not work. Like, it was literally undermined by its own founder. We're still sticking to it, and people are still holding it up. And the greatest sense of shame, I think, will quite rightly be reserved for those people. And the damage they've done is horrific. So that's what I know.
Right. And it's staggering. And then when you think about how we're collecting that data, how we're collecting that, like you mentioned, a phone call, it's a little bit different than asking someone to fill out a police report. Because if I'm the victim of something, one, to have the space where I'm now calling the police and letting the police know, like, my significant other just came at me with a baseball bat, whatever it is. Then you get the police officers who most likely are men coming into the home and looking at you like, come on, man, are you kidding me? You're going to call the cops right now on this situation? So there's a level of shame that's associated with it. So what can we do for young men to normalize, it's okay to reach out for help. It's okay to start having this conversation. They don't want to be labeled as like a quote unquote pussy. Are you kidding me? You're such a pussy. You're going to call the police. Like, how do we normalize that conversation for boys?
Just normalize it by talking about it. It's a problem sort of solves itself. The more we talk about it, the more it's solved. It's a cyclic thing. And I would say, although you are right, and a lot of police officers do have that attitude, the police officers are also, in a very real way, they also experience the same training, the same Duluth training that I talked about in domestic violence industry. So the police officers are taught that all perpetrators are men and all victims are women, to the point where a man who calls the police about being abused, he's more likely to be arrested than the person abusing him. I know Don Dutton, who's a Canadian researcher, probably the most respected domestic violence researcher in North America, perhaps the world. He talked about a man who was stabbed by his wife. He called the police. The knife was literally sticking out of the man's body, and he was still arrested. And it's like literally laughable how we do that. And for all this talk of like wanting to destroy stereotypes around men and men can be whoever they want, that never seems to expand to this man is an abuse victim. Because as soon as you say that, everyone laughs at him. Like, everyone looks at him with cynicism, and we just don't believe male victims of abuse exist. We're growing used to the idea that they exist, but we are in no way recognizing the full scope and scale of male victimhood. Certainly not in a way we see male perpetration. And also, I mean, it is worth saying that it hurts women as well, as it always does, because women who are violent perpetrators of abuse, they're not being helped. They deserve to be helped too. They need intervention strategies to help them control their anger, their violence. And also, those women are being sent back to, because we're not seeing women as violent, we're leaving them vulnerable to retaliation from the man. So a lot of women are killed in self-defense because they're part of this cycle of violence. And because we're not breaking that cycle of violence, we're leaving women vulnerable and men. And on that note, it's worth saying that half of all abusive relationships are bilaterally violent, which means both partners are doing it. And then if you look at the other half where it's non-reciprocal violence, so it's just one partner, 70% of that is by women. So this trope of male violence, sole male violence, is 30% of 50%. So what, 15%, right? Like 15% of domestic violence is the man does it on his own. 70% of that remaining half is the woman doing it on her own. And then half of all violence is bilateral violence. So this meme of, you know, the violent man on his own abusing his wife or girlfriend, that is a tiny wedge. I mean, it's an important wedge, but that is not a true like painting of domestic violence in any sort of way. It's contorted and it's narrow and it's antiquated and harmful, and it needs to go in the bin. It needs to be broadened. Not in the bin. It needs to be broadened because that is a part of violence, but it's not broad enough, and it's not like high enough definition. It's just cartoonish.
And George, I'll go back to before when I said about 70% of the kids that are suspended from school are boys, 95% of the kids that are in juvenile facilities are boys. Boys are not considered a subgroup population in school. So when you look at, like, if I'm a school leader and I need to determine what are the areas of weakness, and I have, so I'll look at, there's minorities, we look at, you know, like special education, and in those different areas of special education, it could be like a specific learning disability, could be a kid with a you know, some type of a physical disability as well. So those are populations that I could look at and determine this subgroup needs my help. Gender is not a subgroup. Boys are not considered a subgroup, but they are one of the most underserved populations in schools that we can potentially help. And I'll use this. I listened to you on a podcast talking about when we think about violence in relationship to police. There's such a disparity among, like, the number of Americans, I think we talked about, being killed by police. It's something like 95 to 99% are men, but we don't ever think about it in that way. And why is that?
Oh, I mean, the idea of male disadvantage makes people want to throw up, apparently. Like, it's like we're allergic to men having any sort of disadvantage, especially systemic disadvantage. But you're right. Like, I mean, I'll do the virtuous thing and I'll say that police brutality is certainly a racial issue. And I went to the BLM marches and I did all of that. And it certainly is something that disproportionately impacts Black Americans. Black Americans are about 3.5 times more likely to be killed by a police officer than white Americans. So 3.5 times more likely. But a man is about 20 times more likely to be killed by a police officer than a woman. So the number is about 95, 96% of Americans killed by police are men. And I never saw that dynamic brought up. I never saw it brought up as a racial and gendered issue that primarily impacts Black men, and it clearly does. It clearly does. And then you walk into this crazy cognitive dissonance where, if you say that, people say, well, men are more violent. Obviously, they're going to be killed more often, and that, to be fair, it will explain some of the gap, but by no means all of it. But you would never say that to Black people. You wouldn't say Black people are more violent and deserve and not deserve, but that's why they're being killed. That's such an outrageously racist thing to say, and not true. And we say that like that for men, or men are more violent. Again, we're just excusing it because it's easy. It's more comfortable for us to say that and to actually do the work and examine our own sense of prejudice and consider the fact that maybe we are actually being sexist towards men, and men can experience systemic disadvantages, which they absolutely can. There are loads of intersectional issues that I talk about that on my page, about minority men, gay men, working class men, and I think that's a really important lens to have.
Agreed. And one thing that you talk about, and I mentioned it right off the bat, was talking about men's mental health. And when I said, like, what can we do about some of these problems, you said, well, we need to talk about it, which is what you're doing. You are, and you're getting a lot of love, but you're also getting a lot of hate for just putting some stats out there and having people look at things in a little bit of a different way. And I do believe the problem named is the problem solved. Like, once we can say, like, okay, let's put this up there and let's all take a look at it from different perspectives, and let's come to some kind of a common language, recognizing that this is a problem. Like, we need to do something about this. So one thing that you do talk about, and the last thing that I'll ask you to share a little bit of information around, is men's mental health and the idea of suicide. And one thing that I talk to schools about are boys are 3.5 times more likely to commit suicide than girls. right? In two schools that I work in currently, within the last calendar year, they've had boys. One boy was in 11th grade and one boy was in 5th grade, 11 years old, committed suicide within the last year. And these boys were, you would say, oh, they're quiet, they're shy, but they did not have anyone to talk to what was going on in their head. They didn't have anyone to open up to. They didn't have that mentor, like I mentioned before, the coach, the teacher, anyone to go to. And this is what it resulted in, is them taking their own lives. So what can we do? Like, talk to us a little bit about your research around men's mental health in relationship to what we're seeing with suicide. And then, is there anything that we can do besides just talking about it? What else can we do?
Well, I mean, there's so many things I could say. I mean, starting off the top, and this is certainly not the most important thing, but just destigmatizing suicide and talking about it more. One of the things people say, and you've been saying it, it's committed suicide. That goes back to when suicide was a crime. So you commit a crime.
Right.
So the people encourage others to say died by suicide or ended their life. But the word commit, it has a sense of guilt and criminality to it, which it was. It was a criminal act, but no longer, and obviously it shouldn't be. I certainly encourage boys and men to talk openly, in as much as I can encourage the people they're talking to listen to what they've got to say and act upon what they've heard. I often find that talking is an excellent way of dealing with a problem, but often it doesn't solve the problem itself. So we don't really listen to the things that boys and men are telling us. We just think the act of them talking is enough, and it certainly helps. And it helps us understand what they're going through, but not just as individuals, but as a society, we have a duty to help change the things that are causing them distress. So we're moving away now, thankfully, from this biomedical model of suicidal pain, where people seem to think that suicide, especially suicide in men, through being toxic, is some sort of chemical imbalance in their brain that can be medicated away. But often it's not that. The cause of male suicide is not primarily a mental health problem, although for a lot of men it is. It's primarily a systemic structural issue that's putting personal stresses on men. So like things like 1 in 3 male suicides is related to relationship breakdown. So either being a victim of domestic violence or having a messy divorce. I know 1 in 5 suicides, so 20% of male suicides in the UK have been tied to family courts. So losing custody of children, again, divorces. And then with that comes like debt. So debt is a massive cause of male suicide. Men losing their jobs, going into debt. They can't pay their mortgage. They lose their house. They end their life. And in a cold way, I recently heard male suicide as a rational, solution-based decision that men make when they can't solve the problem anymore. So they lost a job, they lost a child, they're going to debt. And they're like, it's actually not some irrational decision they're making because they're mentally unwell. It's seen as a solution-based outcome. And once you see it as a societal phenomenon that's putting men into positions where they can't solve the problem because they're not getting the help, and we refuse to listen to what they've got to say, you start to see men with more sympathy and more understanding. And again, like broadening that discussion a little bit more and accepting a bit of responsibility for each of us to helping solve the problem, not just expecting men to be less toxic or, less problematic and change their mindset. So there's a lot of things to say. But of course, talking is a massive help. I've just been talking to a guy recently who's set up his own page called the Happy Sad Club. And it's just about men talking and women talking. And I hope he doesn't mind me talking about his history, but he's dealt with these problems and he has depression. And the solution for him was talking. So some men, the solution is certainly talking. And I would say all men would benefit from talking, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem they're talking about. That has to be solved by everybody. And I would encourage people to think more deeply about that. That's why I get into hot water, because I talk about the things that men are talking about. So domestic violence is, as male victims of domestic violence, especially by women, is horrendously controversial to talk about. And yet 11% of domestic violence victims who are men attempt suicide. So it's a huge cause of male suicide. And there's about 3 million male victims of abuse. And if you consider 11% of them may attempt suicide, that is a massive, massive problem. And yet no one wants to talk about it. If anything, people that advocate against male suicide, which is an excellent thing to do, they don't talk about domestic violence against men because it's very politically unpopular. And I'm like, you're betraying your own ideals, because that is a massive cause of male suicide. like, again, like sexual violence against boys, for example, like the chance, if a boy is sexually abused in childhood, the chance of him attempting suicide later in life goes up 10 times. And because we're not protecting boys in the way we described earlier, through just seeing them as like perpetual perpetrators of sexual violence, we're leaving them vulnerable to being abused, and we're leaving the men they become vulnerable to suicide. So unless you're willing to have these difficult conversations, then I would question how useful you're being. You may look good, you may look great. People might be, oh, well done, good job. But you're not actually having that much impact, in my opinion. And I feel like that's why I'm diving headfirst into those issues. I don't care. Like, I'm playing in the mud. Like, I'll happily and proudly talk about boys who are being sexually abused and men who are being subjected to domestic violence. And I won't apologize for that, because I think it's necessary if we are really actually going to take male suicide as a serious issue, which it absolutely is, the number one cause of number one risk to my life and your life. And the majority of men listening to this is suicide. Like, it's hard to think of a bigger issue men are facing, and we are failing to adequately tackle it, in my opinion. So don't just tell men to talk, listen to what they've got to say and act upon what you learn. And I feel like to take that away from this podcast and start doing it, because that's the real solution, in my opinion.
And what can we do to start that at a younger age? There's a quote, I don't know who the author of it to attribute it to off the top of my head, but it's, the child that is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And so what can we do to like understand at a young age? What can we do to help these young men normalize the conversation? It's okay to talk about these things. And then what can we do, to put some things into action and to support each other? The power in young men being able to see that we're going through similar struggles, and it's okay to talk about these things. It doesn't mean that you're weak, being able to lean into those vulnerabilities as well, George.
I mean, children learn by seeing, right? Like, children see, children do. That's how childhood works. I know I'm not a parent, but I know enough about children to know that's how it works. So don't be afraid to tell your child what you're going through. And for fathers to tell their sons, especially when they're hurting or what's upset them, obviously don't trauma dump on them. But if you can show your son, this is what pain feels like, and it's healthy and it's okay to feel pain, but it's important you share about it. Like, your dad's going through X, Y, and Z at work and it is upsetting, but I'm going to be okay. And I feel like that child can learn through your expression of pain as a dad or as a mum. They can learn themselves to do it later in life. Like, I'll be very cautious about making this a solution that boys have to solve themselves, because they are just children and they learn by seeing us do it as parents and as adults and as role models. So I'd say they'd be a massive benefactor of men and fathers, especially, talking more courageously and openly about their own pain. And like crying, I never saw my dad cry once. I never really saw him sad. And I have worked very hard not to become like that. So I'd say be a role model to your child in ways that take courage, and don't be afraid to open up and share with them your sadness and your happiness. But again, I want to caveat that by saying don't trauma dump on your child.
Right. Agreed.
Be careful with how you act, how you take that advice.
And I'll tell parents this all the time. As I work with young men, I also have a coordinate thing where I help the parents as well, because it's not easy to be the parent of especially of a middle or high school age boy right now. But to normalize the conversations of, you're not going to succeed in every single thing you do. So instead of just telling your son the time that you hit the game-winning home run or made the shot, talk about the time that you missed
it,
the layup, and how did it feel? Like, it's okay, because they're going to go through failures in their life. So what can they do to normalize those things as a parent of a young man? So George,
well, yeah, I'd say failure is far more formative than success in my experience. Like, the ways I failed have helped me far more than success. And they're if anything, more worthy of sharing than my successes. And there's way more failure than success in my life, and that's okay. And that's very, very normal. It's just not normal to not share that, and you should be sharing it. So no, I'm just agreeing, and it's good to fail.
100% agree with that as well. So before I ask my last question of you, George, where can we get in touch with you? How do we find you? Besides like this, you know, the just the George moniker that we can't really find you. We're not gonna like look for you, but just to find your page.
Oh, you can come try and find me if you want. But I am just one man. I am not supported in any way. There's no team of people doing this. There's no funding, so I'm limited in the amount of work I can do. So I've dedicated myself to Instagram for now, and you can find me on Instagram primarily at the Tin Men, the Tin Men, one word, on Instagram. And from there's a Discord and there's a Twitter page and stuff like that. But anything I do that's worthy of knowing will be found at Instagram, the Tin Men.
And again, highly recommend 100% follow along with what he's doing. And perhaps in the future, we'll see the bright velour tracksuit with the big size 14 sneakers and the hair and everything like that. Last question,
anything's
George.
Possible.
Right on. Last question I always ask to end the podcast is someone who's listening to this podcast has got a tremendous amount of value by hearing about you, your story, what you're doing, your perspective, and they press pause right now. They press stop right now. What's one thing that a listener can do, and by doing this one thing could really change their life or even people that are in their life?
I'm going to tell you what I don't think you should be doing, and only because I'm aware of a lot of parents listening, and that is never spank your child under any circumstance. Never be physically violent towards your child, no matter what they're doing, no matter how badly they're misbehaving. And I say that because the most prevalent and most under-discussed cause of domestic violence later in life are experiences of spanking, because basically you're teaching your child that he can correct another person's misbehavior through physical violence. So a child's misbehaving, a parent hits the child to correct that behavior, and that child then learns that through physical violence I can correct misbehavior later in life. And it is quite literally how domestic violence works. Like your wife or husband is misbehaving and you want to correct that through physical violence, and that is learned through childhood. So never spank your child under any circumstance, ever. And I know it's hard and it's easy for me to say that as someone without a child, but it doesn't work. It doesn't actually correct the behavior. It doesn't lead to any sort of better outcomes. And it is, as I said, the most prevalent and under-discussed cause of that child becoming violent towards his partner or her partner later in life. And again, that's never discussed. You'll never see a domestic violence campaign talk about that, because they're just enamored with this idea of male violence, which makes very little sense. So that's why I'd ask you, please don't do that.
And if you feel the need to get out some type of aggression, go for a run, go do some push-ups, hit a punching bag, do something like that. If you need to get out that.
Absolutely. Well, not in front of your child. Right. Don't be punching a punching bag in front of your child either. But I mean, I know Maurice Strauss, who before he died was the leading expert in domestic violence, to the point where he actually founded the field of family violence research. And he said, that's what I said. He said, children see, children do. And he's like, if you raise your child with the idea that violence can correct problems, he or she will become violent later in life. But if you raise a child that discussion and listening is a way to solve problems, you will raise a child that later in life uses words and language and discourse to solve problems. So ask yourself, what child do you want to raise, and start being a role model in that kind of way.
Mic drop moment. Building Men audience, if this resonated in any way, consider liking, subscribing, sharing this out with anyone that you think might get value from the episode. George, appreciate it, Thank you. Man. Let me know if there's anything I could ever do to support you and your mission. I believe it needs to be out there in the world.
We'll do it. We'll do this again.
100%, dude. Building Men audience, go one step further than you thought you could go. We'll see you next time on Building Men.
Thank you.